What if your greatest crossroad was also the hinge of destiny? Imagine feeling your world unravel, like Miriam, a humble baker in ancient Goshen, whose ovens lay cold when the Nile floods buried her village. Standing amid the ruins of her life, she wondered if hope could ever rise from such devastation. Now picture a whisper on the desert wind, a promise older than stone tombs, stirring beneath her fear. Could that same promise, once carried by a foreign priest's daughter in Pharaoh's court, reach across centuries into your own heart? It's a call to faith that no setback can silence, a divine choreography guiding you through every trial. You're not alone at this threshold. There is a sacred design woven into your story, poised to transform ashes into harvest, exile into homecoming. A profound shift awaits, one that will reshape how you see your past and step boldly into a future of renewed purpose. Are you ready to embrace the promise that outlasts every border and binds every heart? Comment, "I'm ready," to begin this journey. Now let us step together. Before there were palaces carved from living rock, before there were thrones draped in gold, there was a promise whispered in the desert wind. Imagine if that promise was carried not on the tongues of kings but on the breath of a foreign priest's daughter. Picture a temple at dawn, its columns wrapped in tendrils of incense and its altars glowing like embers against an endless sky. Somewhere within those hallowed halls a young woman named Asenath walked through dust and shadow, clutching keys that no longer fit any lock but were still held with hope. What if her footsteps echoed toward a destiny no one could foresee? A veil of sunlight crept over the Nile Delta as young Joseph stood before Pharaoh's captains. His name was no longer the one he had borne in Canaan. Now he was Zephanath-Piah, the revealer of secrets. Yet even as robes of authority fell around him, his heart remained tethered to a land of dust and memory. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, the ancient account tells us. Genesis 39 verse 2. How often have we missed the quiet currents beneath such words? Did we see in them the stirring of a covenant that would stretch beyond the sands of Egypt into the bones of two nascent tribes? Imagine the moment when Asenath first heard Joseph speak. Could it be that in his voice she recognized a promise older than any temple scroll? He spoke not of earthly power but of visions. 7 cows, 7 ears of grain, symbols of abundance and famine woven together like threads of one tapestry. In the hush of Pharaoh's court she heard a whisper that could raise bones from exile. Ezekiel had once heard the same breath in a valley of dry bones. He too stood astonished as life surged into skeletons. Could Asenath have felt a similar stirring within her own chest? She was daughter to Potiphera, priest of the sun god. Her life had been a liturgy of fire and chant. Yet she paused when Joseph asked Pharaoh for wisdom not born of Egyptian lore but given by another hand. When counselors faltered before dreams none could decipher, he said, "It is not in me but in the one true God." Genesis 41 verse 16. Could that pronouncement have fractured her world like light through colored glass? Imagine her standing in the shadow of those great columns, watching Joseph receive a ring of authority, wondering whether the God of Abraham could speak through her own idolatrous silence. The palace gardens shimmered with fountains and jasmine. Royal servants carried bowls of pomegranates and figs. In that garden Asenath may have caught her reflection in polished marble, her eyes wide with questions, her youth caught between two worlds. What would it feel like to leave behind a lifetime of ritual, to trade the songs of Ra for an unseen melody? Could the promise carried by a Hebrew slave reach across the gulf of tradition and ignite a spark in her soul? In the hush before their union Pharaoh presented Asenath to Joseph. No love song preceded their marriage. No twilight walk beneath the palms. The scriptures simply record a name given and a bride taken. Yet names are vessels of destiny. Her name in Egyptian meant well dedicated to the divine. His Hebrew name meant he increases. Together they would bear children whose names would become motifs of hope and restoration. Manasseh, for God has made me forget my toil. Genesis 41 verse 51. And Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of affliction. Genesis 41 verse 52. Could those names have rang like a new covenant sculpted in flesh? But part 1 of this story is not the biography of a queen. It is the birth of a question. What happens when a promise made beyond all borders finds a home in the heart of the unexpected? What becomes of ancient rituals and golden idols when confronted by a whisper of eternity? As the dust settled around Asenath and Joseph, the world held its breath. Two tribes waited in the wings, still unwritten into the annals of history. Their blood would pulse with the legacies of two faiths, one born in Canaanite hills and one rooted in Egyptian sands. In that moment, even before the first cries of their sons, there was a hush in heaven and on earth. Motifs of promise, dust, return, witness, ashes and breath wove themselves into a single tapestry. Could the dust that once marked a foreign priest's daughter become the ground from which two nations would rise? Could bones scattered in exile stir at the sound of her steps? As twilight gathered over the palace, the hush deepened. A solitary torch burned in the courtyard, its flame dancing like a guardian's eye. And in the soft glow of that flame, Asenath stood at the threshold of a covenant she did not yet understand. What did she carry within her heart? What ancient promise stirred beneath her ribs? And what does it mean when heaven's design reaches into places we have long forgotten? Ends not with certainty but with wonder. In the space between sand and stone, between ritual and faith, a story was beginning. One that would ask whether love, destiny, and divine promise could cross the greatest of divides. And so we return to the question that makes history tremble. Could the forgotten wife of Joseph be the quiet cornerstone of a covenant that transcends borders and belief? A veil of early morning mist hovered over the granaries of Memphis, lending the massive stone silos an almost dreamlike glow. Imagine the chill in the air as Asenath stepped across the dew-damp courtyard, her once ornate robes exchanged for plain linen robes of administration. Here in the warehouses where Joseph marshaled Egypt's bounty, every grain of wheat was a seed of survival. Each ear held within it the whispered hope that dust could yield life. How heavy must her heart have been as she traced the curve of a clay jar, etched with the symbol of Ra, now repurposed to store the promise of plenty. She was no longer merely the daughter of Potiphar. She was the wife of Pharaoh's second-in-command, the Hebrew dreamer elevated by divine revelation. And at her side, two new names waited for their unveiling: Manasseh and Ephraim. Could a mother's heart contain such paradox, gripping sorrow and joy in the same breath? Genesis 41 verses 51 to 52 tells us the meanings: forgetfulness of toil and fruitfulness in affliction. But what did these names mean in the daily rhythm of palace life? In the hush before dawn, Asenath would slip away to the river's edge. The Nile's smooth surface mirrored her reflection, eyes searching, unsettled. Here she would lay her palm flat against the water, watching ripples distort her image. Could this fleeting distortion mirror the transformation stirring within her? The foreign wife of a Hebrew statesman, once a priest's daughter, now tasked with nurturing the seeds of two nascent tribes. What would it feel like to cradle newborn limbs swaddled not in royal silk but in homespun cloth, knowing these children would inherit a legacy they could scarcely yet comprehend? There were nights when the cries of infants blended with the chant of temple priests. Asenath would rock the cradle beneath vaulted ceilings, the scent of frankincense mingling with the soft breath of her sons. Manasseh, whose name signified a release from the memory of past suffering. Ephraim, whose name declared a harvest in hardship. And in the stillness she wondered, would they ever grow to know the pain their names sought to reverse? Could a name alone unlock the power to forget betrayal, to transform sorrow into strength? One afternoon, Joseph led her through the corridors of power. Pharaoh's council gathered in solemn assembly, their robes rustling like autumn leaves. Grain was being dispersed to the poor and foreigner alike. At each portico, Egyptian elders bowed, Moabite merchants knelt, Canaanite families received ration tokens. In that moment, Asenath saw the vast tapestry of humanity under Joseph's stewardship. Could she have imagined that her own children would one day be counted among these tribes? Would they embrace the land of their birth or yearn for a homeland they had never seen? She often recalled a prophecy whispered in the desert wind, "For I will bring you up out of the land of Egypt and into the land of the Canaanites." Genesis 15 verses 13 to 14. Those words had once been a distant promise to ancestors she did not know. Now they echoed in her maternal soul. Yet Egypt was all she had ever known. The pyramids had been her cradle, the Nile her lullaby, Would her sons, born amid the scents of Egyptian incense, ever heed a call to return? At twilight, the palace gardens shimmered once more. Torches cast long shadows across marble pathways. Asenath walked between rows of date palms, tracing the smooth bark like a silent prayer. Behind her, the palace gates closed with a final click, a reminder of both shelter and confinement. She paused beneath a moonlit arch, eyes lifted to the sky. The stars were foreign constellations. Orion's belt gleamed above the western horizon. In Canaan, those stars were witnesses to Abraham's faith. Here, they watched over her as silent guardians. What would those stars witness in the lives of her sons? In quiet moments, Joseph would join her, his gaze steady with the weight of revelation. He spoke of scrolls he longed to see, of the covenant made to his forefathers. Yet he never imposed his faith. Instead, he invited her to listen. His words were gentle ripples, not crashing waves. Could love be more persuasive than ritual? Could devotion born of intimacy undo the years of priestly sacrifice she had known? There was one evening when her father, Potiphar, came to visit. He entered the palace with the solemn dignity of a high priest, bearing gifts of carved ivory and offerings of oil for the lamps. His eyes flickered between pride and sorrow as he saw his daughter standing beside the Hebrew governor. No words bridged the gulf between their worlds. Instead, Asenath placed her hand on his arm, guiding him toward the granaries. There he beheld the stored wealth of Egypt's foresight, 7 years of plenty gathered in silent testament. Could he see in that provision a God beyond Ra? Could the unspoken testimony of grain speak louder than any hymn? Their conversation was but a whisper, yet it carried the weight of dynasties. Potiphar's voice cracked when he asked, "Who has given you this power?" Genesis 41 verse 39. And Asenath, drawing a steady breath, replied not with grand theology but with a quiet conviction, "My husband speaks on behalf of the God of Abraham." In that confession the world seemed to tilt on its axis. What would it cost her to embrace the faith of her husband? Could loyalty to a husband herald loyalty to his God? Soon the famine crept across the land like a silent hunger. Caravan after caravan surged toward Egypt, bearing bundles of olives, goatskin wines, even children sold into servitude in exchange for barley. In every caravan she glimpsed a reflection of displacement and despair. Mothers clutching hunger-gnawed children, elders with sun-scorched cloaks. Would her own sons one day feel the tremor of exile as Pharaoh's sons? Or would they remain forever anchored in Egypt's stone? In those days Asenath assumed new responsibilities. She devised her own system of relief, baskets woven by temple artisans, filled to the brim with grain tokens. She trained scribes to record each distribution, ensuring fairness even to strangers. And through it all she felt a stirring deeper than duty. A covenant calling her beyond palace walls to the edges of human need. Could an Egyptian princess become a steward of mercy in the name of a Hebrew God? But amid her service came whispers. Some Egyptians marveled at her devotion. Others whispered she had abandoned her birthright. A priestess spat that she had forsaken Ra's glow. Would her sons inherit the scorn of their mother's choices? Or would they rise above tradition to claim a heritage of faith? Late one night, Asenath found herself in the royal library, a vast hall of scrolls and clay tablets. She ran her fingers along the spines of leather-bound tomes. Among them, a Hebrew scroll tucked between Egyptian chronicles caught her eye. It bore the words, "They shall be a people for me, and I will be their God." Exodus 6 verse 7. Her breath caught. Here in the hush of parchment and papyrus, ancient promises converged. Could her sons be numbered among those people? Would she, an Egyptian daughter, become the mother of a covenant people? She closed the scroll, heart racing. A single candle guttered, then burned steady. In that delicate light, she lifted her eyes and saw not just words but a pathway. A path that ran from Nile waters to Jordan streams, from palace stones to promised hills. What journey awaited two Hebrew Egyptian boys? What destiny beckoned at the end of that path? As the candle's flame steadied, Asenath rose and tucked the scroll beneath her robe. Tomorrow she would return it to its place. For now she carried both faiths within her. Egyptian blood in her veins. Hebrew promise in her heart. two legacies intertwined like the braids of a single rope. What if God's design always danced on the edges of contradiction, weaving disparate threads into a tapestry beyond human sight? Closes not with resolution but with a question that ripples across time. Can a heart trained in idols learn to worship the unseen? And can a mother's love bridge the widest of cultural chasms to nurture a faith that transcends borders? Asenath stands at the threshold of that question, her gaze fixed on the scroll's fading glow. What will she decide? And what will the world become when her sons rise to claim their inheritance? Dawn broke over the walled city of Goshen in a palette of violet and rose, as if the sky itself bore witness to a new chapter of destiny. In the quiet streets, carts laden with grain rumbled toward astonished families who for months had known only gnawing hunger. By mid-morning, word spread that the famine had become a funnel, directing the multitudes toward Egypt's granaries. Imagine the scene, a river of humanity flowing beneath the shadow of pyramids, carrying with it the weight of survival and the sting of displacement. And standing at the heart of it all was Asenath, robe lightly dusted by the desert breeze, her gaze steady as she watched mothers press coins into her children's palms, only to receive the golden grain that whispered promise. Yet beneath the orchestrated relief lay a deeper tension. For with each ration dispensed, Egypt's subtle grip on the region strengthened. Fields once tilled by foreign hands fell silent. Young men sold themselves into servitude to afford a single basket of barley. What would happen when the famine receded and the debts came due? Could an empire built on foresight transform into one of subtle bondage? Joseph's wisdom had foreseen the coming storm, but could mercy alone avert the chains that longing might forge? Asenath, child of a priestess and wife of a Hebrew governor, felt the undercurrents of power and precarious gratitude entwining like vines around her heart. Late one afternoon, she walked the dim corridors of the royal court, her steps echoing like questions unanswered. Lamplight flickered against the carved bulls' heads that snarled upon lintels. In one hand she cradled a scroll of petitions, letters from displaced nobles begging for compassion. In the other, a sealed tablet bearing the decree, "All land shall be Pharaoh's, only the seed shall be your own." Genesis 47 verse 23. Could the promise of protection become the shadow of dominion? The decree itself was penned in careful script, its words both balm and chain. Asenath paused beneath a relief depicting a king smiting his foes. A familiar knot of unease tightened in her chest. What role would her sons play in the tapestry of power being woven? That evening, Joseph summoned her to the palace sanctuary, a hall of alabaster and gold where priests of Ra had once invoked the sun's rise. Now its hearth was used for a different purpose, to kindle incense in honor of the God of Abraham. The air shimmered with myrrh, and carved pillars bore the stories of patriarchs rather than pharaohs. Here, Joseph spoke of his lineage. "My fathers were shepherds who wandered under stars like these." He laid open the olive wood chest that held his family's talisman. Asenath traced her fingers over its smooth surface, feeling the pulse of generations. Could the root of her children's identity lie in these humble stories rather than imperial pomp? He told her of God's promise to Abraham, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Genesis 12 verse 3. Asenath's breath hitched. There, beneath columns that once echoed tribal rites, she stood at the intersection of worlds, Egypt's grandeur and Canaan's promise. What did it mean to be a blessing? Could a blessing flow through her womb to water nations she could scarcely name? Their conversation was gentle, yet charged with the gravity of history. Joseph did not command her belief, he invited her empathy. He spoke of Jacob's weeping at Goshen's gates, of patriarchs buried in foreign soil, yet hoping for a return. Could it be that longing for home was more sacred than the soil underfoot? Asenath felt the weight of dual allegiance, loyalty to her birthland and a yearning for something beyond. In the following days, she embarked on a journey outside the palace walls. Clad in a simple cloak, she joined a caravan bound for Canaan's border, an escort of grain carts that snaked through the desert. At each settlement, she stepped down to distribute provisions and speak with elders whose children she had never met. Imagine the hush as those elders realized that Egypt's governor's wife knelt before them in humility, eyes steady with compassion. Could a foreign princess become a midwife of mercy in a land not her own? Under the open sky, Asenath knelt before an elderly storyteller whose hands trembled like autumn leaves. He bore the name Hezer, remnant, and his village lay at the edge of Jacob's inheritance. He unraveled a cloth bundle to reveal a tattered scroll, its Hebrew script faded by decades. "These are our bones," he whispered, "the record of covenant." He read to her a verse, "They shall come back even to the land of Egypt." Ezekiel 37 verse 12. His voice cracked as he spoke of exile and return. Asenath felt tears trace silent paths down her cheeks. Could she be part of this promise, bridging the river between exile and home? That night, beside the campfire, she laid her palm against the cooled embers and closed her eyes. The stars wheeled overhead, the same constellations that had guided Abraham, the same lights that bathed Jacob's vision of a ladder to heaven. The desert wind carried a whisper, ashes and breath, dust and bones, promise and return. Each motif repeated itself like a refrain in her heart. Could those motifs become the anthem of her children's inheritance? Returning to Goshen, Asenath carried more than grain. She carried stories. She spoke of Hezer's village, of fields that awaited seed, of bones yearning to rise. And in the palace sanctuary she pressed these stories into Joseph's hands. He listened, cradling each word as though it were a living thing. What would become of a covenant shaped in exile, nurtured by mercy, and anchored in the womb of an Egyptian wife? Asenath's transformation was not sudden. It was a river carving its course over years of shared purpose. Yet in that river lay purpose beyond survival, a covenant of inclusion, a melody that harmonized Egyptian sand and Canaanite rock. What if God's design always wove such tributaries among unlikely shores? Closes on a question echoing across the dunes. Can the children of two worlds become the heralds of a promise that transcends both? As their mother, Asenath holds the key. But what lock will it open? And what song will rise from the land where sand meets stone? A golden haze settled over Goshen as camels and chariots wove between tents and palaces alike. Word had reached every village that Jacob, the aged patriarch, would soon step foot on Egyptian soil. Imagine a caravan threading its way through fields of grain so abundant they swayed like a sea of hope. At its head walked Jacob himself, frail yet unbowed, staff in hand, eyes alight with the weight of a promise centuries old. Could a man nearing the end of his days still carry the fire of covenant in his bones? Within the palace gates, Joseph prepared for the reunion of lifetimes. Asenath stood beside him in the grand reception hall, its walls lined with columns carved in lotus motifs and Hebrew epigraphs alike. She watched Joseph smooth the robes he had chosen, the same robes he once wore as a servant in Canaan, and wondered whether the man before her felt the same tremor of destiny she did. What would it feel like to welcome your father into the land that once nearly broke you? When Jacob entered, time seemed to stutter. His trembling hand reached for Joseph's, and tears fell like rain upon the threshold. In that moment all protocol vanished. Fathers and sons collapsed into one another. Could such a reunion contain the weight of betrayal forgiven, of years swallowed in shadow, of promises whispered in tents under desert stars? Asenath watched quietly, her breath caught between joy and reverence. She remembered the first time she saw Joseph bound in chains, eyes cast down in prison gloom. And now here he stood in robes of authority, hand raised in blessing. How many dust-laden paths had led to this convergence of exile and homecoming? Joseph guided Jacob to a raised dais where two small cushions awaited. There sat Manasseh and Ephraim, their eyes bright with curiosity. Jacob's gaze softened as he beheld his grandsons, the fruit of foreign union, the seeds of a covenant stretching beyond any border. The old man's voice trembled as he spoke, "In you God has caused me to forget all my toil and all my father's house." Genesis 41 verse 51. He laid his right hand upon Ephraim, the younger, and his left upon Manasseh, deliberately crossing the customary blessing. Could a blessing spoken in that moment shift the course of nations? The court fell silent as Jacob declared, "God will make you a multitude of nations." Genesis 48 verse 4. Each word hung in the air like an ember waiting to ignite. Asenath felt the hush seep into her bones. What did it mean to be the mother of nations unborn? Could the dust of Egypt become the dust of promise? The ceremony ended, but its echo lingered. In the courtyard, Asenath caught Joseph's eye and saw gratitude mingled with awe. He pressed her hand with quiet strength. Together they walked beneath date palms swaying in the desert breeze. Could two people from different worlds carry such a heritage bound in mercy and mystery? That evening, in the sanctuary where incense still curled toward vaulted arches, Asenath unfurled a tapestry she had woven. It depicted a ladder stretching from earth to stars, its rungs inscribed with the names of Isaiah's visions. Bones rising again, Ezekiel 37 verse 12, ashes and breath, Ezekiel 37 verse 5, promise and return, Genesis 15 verse 13. Each stitch was a prayer. Each color a reflection of her journey from temple halls to covenant halls. Could tapestry and prayer become witnesses to a divine design? In the hush before sleep, Asenath dreamed of raising her sons beneath foreign skies. She saw Ephraim leading caravans along trading routes, his footsteps echoing with the legacy of blessing. She saw Manasseh standing before congregations of the displaced, his voice carrying words of healing and forgetfulness. Could their lives become living scrolls, testifying that faith transcends pedigree? But even as dreams glowed with hope, shadows lingered. Whispers reached the palace of murmurs among Egyptian priests uneasy at the daughters of Ra turning their hearts elsewhere. Some nobles questioned whether a foreign lineage could mingle with royal favor without fracturing tradition. Would the sons of Asenath inherit suspicion alongside their blessing? Could the promise of inclusion become a burden of displacement? In the days that followed, Asenath returned to the riverbank where she had first wrestled with her reflection. Nile waters lapped at her feet as she cast fragments of clay pots, remnants of her old life, into the current. Each shard vanished beneath ripples. Could the breaking of vessels symbolize the shattering of old identities? Above her, cranes wheeled across the sky. Their wings carved patterns against the dawn. To Joseph's people they heralded the season of departure. To Egyptians they signaled plenty beyond the sunset. Under their flight Asenath whispered a vow, that her sons would carry both legacies, Egypt's abundance and Israel's promise, woven into one destiny. Could wings above mirror the lifting of two tribes toward something greater? Back in the palace, a council gathered to discuss the future of Goshen. Asenath stood among scribes and elders, her finger tracing a map of garnished fields and boundless pastures. She proposed a treaty wherein Goshen's people would serve as stewards of surplus while retaining their autonomy. It was a compromise born of mercy and wisdom. Could compromise itself be an instrument of covenant? News arrived that Canaan's elders yearned for guidance on resettlement. Fields lay fallow, wells ran dry. Would Goshen's grain once again become the lifeline of famine's refugees? Asenath penned a letter, her first official decree, offering secure passage and settlement under Egyptian protection. In her script the old motifs danced, dust and life, exile and return, promise witnessed in grain. Could paper and ink shape the future as powerfully as prayer? Late that night, Joseph found her in the library, tracing the outlines of a clay tablet inscribed with the 10 Commandments, copied from Hebrew law. The tablet was meant for their household shrine. As he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, he asked, "Do you believe this law speaks to all people?" Asenath paused, her gaze steady. "I believe it speaks to every heart willing to listen." His smile held both relief and wonder. Could a law given to one people become a song for all nations? In the flicker of torchlight they imagined a world where dust from Egyptian fields and dust from Canaan's hills would mingle under a covenant banner. They whispered of Yahweh's promise that all peoples of the earth shall be blessed in your seed. Genesis 22 verse 18. Could the seed sown in Asenath's womb become the roots of blessing reaching every corner of earth? Closes on the image of Asenath standing barefoot on palace steps at dawn, scroll in one hand, tapestry in the other, eyes fixed on horizons both familiar and unseen. In that poised stillness she embodies the question echoing through centuries. Can a life built on faith forged in exile yield harvests beyond every border? And in her silence lies an invitation to wonder whether divine design always weaves its greatest patterns through the unexpected threads of history. Dawn's first light filtered through the reed screens of Goshen, casting long shafts of gold across the courtyard where Manasseh and Ephraim now stood at their mother's side. Imagine two young men emerging from the shadows of palace halls into the open air of destiny. Their shoulders bore the promise of nations, and their eyes reflected the memory of exile. Could the sons of an Egyptian princess and a Hebrew governor carry within them the breath of two worlds and yet walk a single path? Asenath watched them muster the courage to step forward beneath the vaulted arch where Joshua and Hezekiah's names would one day be whispered. She remembered the hush that fell when they first opened their mouths to speak in the tongue of their father's people. Their accents bore the lilt of Nile waters and the cadence of Canaanite fields. What would it feel like to bridge each syllable with loyalty and love? In the great hall, Joseph convened the elders of Israel and the priests of Egypt. Two councils met under one roof. Imagine the tension in that assembly room where silver censers once burned incense to Ra and now smoke curled in honor of Yahweh. Manasseh rose to address the gathering. His voice was steady as he spoke of stewardship of land and heritage. Genesis 47 verse 23 had declared, "The land is Pharaoh's, yet the seed is yours." Could an offer of shared sovereignty hold the seeds of unity rather than division? Ephraim followed, his words a tapestry of mercy and remembrance. He spoke of ashes and breath. As ashes may return to form new flames, so too shall our people rise from the memory of affliction. Ezekiel 37 verses 5-6. In that moment the hall fell silent. Could a generation born in plenty yet marked by famine bear within them the spark of resurrection? In the days that followed, Goshen pulsed with new life. Wheat fields swayed under sunlit skies. Children chased each other through orchards heavy with figs. Asenath walked among them, her hand tracing the swell of grain heads. Each stalk was a living witness to covenant kept. Each thread of harvest cloth she wove carried motifs of promise, dust, return, witness. How many future midwives would cradle covenant children within these fields? But as the seasons turned, shadows gathered on the horizon. News came of unrest beyond the border. Foreign tribes stirred with envy at Goshen's abundance. Raiders swept through Canaan's outskirts, seizing camels and burning smoke signals of warning. Manasseh and Ephraim donned shepherds' cloaks and shielded the people. Could the sons of a Hebrew-Egyptian union defend a trust between nations without betraying either? One moonlit night Asenath followed the brothers to the edge of the desert. The sky was a scroll of stars, Orion's belt blazing like a sword of promise. They knelt together upon sand cooled by dusk. Manasseh laid a hand on his mother's shoulder. "You gave us our names," he said. "We bear both sorrow and strength in our veins." Could a mother's love transcend the weight of prophecy to grant her sons the courage to shape history? Ephraim added, "We will guard the memory of exile yet shepherd hope like spring rain." And beneath that vast canopy of celestial witnesses the three of them felt the tremor of destiny. Could covenant faith forge a bond stronger than steel and gentler than a mother's breath? Back in the palace, Asenath confronted her own legacy. Her hands wove a new tapestry, this time of cedar and linen. Its design traced two trees entwined at the roots yet reaching toward separate heavens. On one tree the sun god symbol lay dormant beneath braided vines. On the other the burning bush glowed with unseen fire. Could art carry the weight of identity where words falter? She placed the tapestry in the council chamber so that every leader who passed would ponder its riddle. Could a house divided yet joined endure? Could a people born of two faiths stand firm when storms of doubt assailed them? In the hush before dawn, Joseph came to the tapestry and traced the lines with reverence. "Our story is woven here," he said softly. "Will our children know both homes as sacred?" Asenath met his gaze and saw in his eyes the same question echoed. Could the silent patterns of cloth shape a legacy beyond their lifetimes? Soon Jacob's passing drew near. The aged patriarch lay upon his deathbed, surrounded by kin. Asenath sat at his feet, her sons flanking her like pillars of promise. Jacob's final blessing fell first upon Joseph's own head, then upon Manasseh and Ephraim with hands crossed once more. "Let my name live in them," he whispered. Genesis 48 verse 16. Could a blessing spoken at life's end reach across centuries to guide wandering souls? After Jacob breathed his last, Asenath led a silent procession to Shechem's fields where burial rites awaited. Dust crunched beneath their steps as twilight brushed the horizon. She lifted her eyes to the hills that once echoed with Abraham's tent pegs. Could the dust that had carried her as a child now bear her bones beside the patriarchs? At the graveside she released a handful of earth, dust and ashes and breath intermingled. And in that sacred gesture she felt the continuity of covenant. Promises made before borders, kinship born beyond bloodlines, faith forged in exile. Could the echo of that handful of earth reverberate through ages as testimony to a mother's faith? Closes on the image of Asenath standing between two graves, her father's distant memory and Jacob's honored rest, her sons watchful at her side. In the hush the desert wind carried a question. When mothers sow seeds of hope amid exile's shadow, can those seeds blossom into forests of promise that outlast every border and every time? A soft glow spread across Goshen's horizon as the last lean years slipped away, unveiling fields heavy with grain and orchards bowed under ripening figs. The air carried a scent of renewed promise, scented by the earth's whispered vow. Dust can bloom again. Under that golden dawn, Manasseh and Ephraim rode forth on camels through the border gate, each carrying a leather satchel filled with barley and letters of reconciliation for Canaan's elders. Could this act of returning gifts ever fully erase the memory of bondage? In the palace courtyard, Asenath stood beneath a recreated archway of cedar and acacia, trees she had ordered planted years before, envisioning shade for her children's children. Their trunks, now strong and knotted, bore scrawlings in both hieroglyph and Hebrew: witness, return, promise. She traced her fingertips along the carved words as sunlight wove flickering patterns on the stone floor. Could a mother's hand inscribe destiny more deeply than any scribe's reed? Joseph emerged from the sanctuary, robes trimmed with gold thread that caught the morning light like a river of dawn. He placed a gentle hand on Asenath's shoulder and led her toward the central hall where the people gathered. There, beneath a sky painted with the banners of both Egypt and Israel, he spoke words of unity: "You shall be a blessing, and through you all families of the earth shall be blessed." Genesis 12 verse 3. His voice resonated like temple bells across stilled hearts. Could such a pronouncement bridge the widest chasms of culture and creed? As the crowd dispersed, Asenath watched faces young and old, Hittite merchants laughing with Hebrew farmers, Egyptian priests nodding to Israelite elders. Each handshake was an echo of covenant's call. Unity amid diversity. Could the world beyond these gates learn from a mother who wove two lineages into one tapestry? Later, in the palace library's hush, Asenath opened the final scroll she had commissioned. It was a ledger of names. Hebrew families who had settled in Goshen, Egyptian households who had taken them enduring famine, children born of mixed parentage. Each name was a thread in the grand design. At the bottom she inscribed her own name, Asenath, daughter of a priest yet mother of nations, and then left a blank space labeled simply unknown. Could she have foreseen that her silence in scripture would write itself here in the hearts of generations to come? Night fell with a hush as torches were lit along the reflecting pool, its waters smooth as glass. Under the watchful eyes of carved sphinxes, Asenath and Joseph walked alongside their sons. Reflection danced like fireflies on the water's surface. "Do you ever wonder," Ephraim asked softly, "how many bones lie buried beneath these sands waiting for breath? Could the valley of dry bones ever forget the promise of resurrection?" In that lantern-lit silence, Asenath drew a deep breath, tasting the mingled scents of myrrh and river reeds. She placed her hand against the cool stone rail, feeling the pulse of Egypt beneath her fingertips and the distant heartbeat of Canaan in her bones. Could two worlds collide and yet blend seamlessly within one human heart? Years folded into memory. Manasseh and Ephraim each rose to leadership, one as steward of fields, the other as keeper of laws. Their voices carried the cadence of two ancestries, Egypt's measured harmony and Israel's prophetic call. Under their guidance, Goshen became a sanctuary for wanderers, a crossroads where languages met like rivers converging. Could a mother's courage ignite a legacy that outlived every palace and throne? In her final days, Asenath retreated to the sanctuary she had helped transform. The alabaster columns, once echoing hymns to Ra, now cradled the fragrance of cedar incense and Hebrew blessings. She knelt on a mat of woven reeds, the tapestry of entwined trees at her feet. Above her, sunlight filtered through colored glass, scarlet and sapphire, casting a mosaic that shimmered like a promise. Could heaven's light itself bear witness to a life woven between two worlds? As breath slowed and shadows lengthened, Asenath lifted her eyes to the carved ladder on the wall, its rungs inscribed with every motif of her journey: promise, dust, return, witness, ashes and breath, bones rising again. She pressed her hand to the lowest rung, dust, and then to the highest, breath. Could her touch acknowledge both the fragility of mortality and the eternity of covenant? Her sons stood vigil at her side, Manasseh with eyes firm as granite, Ephraim with gaze soft as dawn. They bent to hear her voice, now a whisper carried on the hush of history. Remember, she breathed, that God's design reaches beyond borders, beyond blood, into the places we least expect. Could her final words echo louder than any decree? Under the canopy of night, the palace lamps dimmed one by one. A distant star, perhaps Orion or Sirius, gleamed like a silent herald above the desert. In that solitary point of light, Asenath's spirit slipped beyond the veil. The earth held a breath, and then exhaled a gentle breeze that swept across fields of grain and back toward Canaan's hills. Could that same breeze carry her legacy to every forgotten border? Concludes not with the closing of a book but with the opening of all horizons. The camera would pull back, rising over temple ruins and rolling dunes, through the arch of history itself, until the world lay beneath a canopy of stars. And in that vast expanse, one question would remain, echoing like a covenant's echo. When a woman once bound by ritual dares to follow the promise of an unseen God, what impossible harvests might spring from the dust of her courage? In this journey we've watched Asenath transform from a priest's daughter in Goshen to the mother of Israel's future tribes, bridge builder between Egyptian rituals and Hebrew covenant. Alongside Joseph, she turned famine into plenty, exile into homecoming, and the dust of despair into fields of harvest. Her story reminds us that true legacy is not built on power or privilege but on acts of compassion, faith, and bold hospitality. Just as Asenath wove two cultures into one tapestry of promise, temples today can do the same through real-world service, feeding the hungry, caring for orphans, and providing a sanctuary of peace for every seeker. When a chua offers free meals to the homeless or free meditation classes to the stressed, it echoes Asenath's spirit, turning ashes into hope and strangers into family. If this story inspired you, like this video to affirm that compassion changes history. Subscribe for more stories that connect ancient wisdom to modern action, and share to challenge your friends to join a temple volunteer program or start their own acts of kindness today. Take that first step, reach out, serve someone in need, and watch God's promise blossom in your own neighborhood. You're not just a viewer, you're the next chapter in this story of hope.